Crosby, who shot JR. I don't remember the character's name, but definitely remember Mary Crosby. She was the daughter of Bing Crosby. Hello, and welcome to an intriguing episode of Gathering More Leaves, a podcast series that explores the fascinating topics of history and genealogy. I'm your host, David M. DeBacker. In episode 14, we learned how a cousin of mine discovered a single line in an obscure book that linked our ancestor, Della Gaume, to a Cordelia Pickering of Pennsylvania. We also learned how DNA testing confirmed this connection and revealed some more cousins and ancestors from the Pickering line. In this episode, we'll dive deeper into the origins of the Pickerings from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. So join us as we explore the life and times of John Pickering of Salem and the 9 generations of his descendants who occupied the same house for over 250 years. In my quest to uncover the history of my immigrant ancestor, John Pickering, I came across 2 volumes that shed more light on the Pickerings. This is a family that occupied the same house in Salem, Massachusetts for 10 consecutive generations until the 1920s. My ancestors were part of the first 3 generations before they moved out. I guess it was getting a little crowded. They moved out and they left Salem and they went to Mendon, Massachusetts. So the first book I stumbled upon was titled The Life of John Pickering by Mary Orne Pickering. And initially, I thought that this was a biography of the John Pickering who lived in the 1630s and 1650s. But then I saw the byline said by his granddaughter, Mary Orne Pickering. And 2 things struck me there. First, she had a middle name, and secondly, she was a woman. And I don't think that they were doing, in Puritan Massachusetts, doing all that much writing in the early 18th century. And then I realized that this book was actually written in the 19th century, and that it was about a much later John Pickering who lived in the latter part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century. But the Mary Orne Pickering's introduction to her book did offer valuable information about my immigrant ancestor, John Pickering. And she recounted that among Salem's early settlers was our John Pickering, who was born in England sometime around 1615, and it had been a family tradition that he hailed from Yorkshire, though there's no written evidence to confirm this claim, and that's stated by her, and then it's also restated in another book that I read. The name Pickering did have historical connections to England, particularly in the vicinity of Scarborough and Whitby. I found Scarborough on a map, and it's on the coast of Yorkshire in the north part of England. But I didn't find Whitby, but I believe it should be there somewhere in that vicinity. And Scarborough was a sea town. The earliest documented information about our English ancestry was found in the Salem town records, and that is where on February the 7th, 1636, an entry mentions John Pickering, a carpenter, being granted inhabitant status. Then 2 years later, the town fathers contracted him to build a meeting house, which he did to their specifications and also to their approval. I'm not sure that this meeting house was built I know this meeting house was built in the 1630s, but I'm not sure if this is the same meeting house where the Salem witch trials were conducted much later in the 1690s. The author notes in her introduction that, quote, few facts connected with his private history remain, but she does mention that John Pickering built a house there in Salem on Broad Street in 1651. And remarkably, this house to this day is a historical site in Salem. And from John Pickering's time down to the 1920s, 10 successive generations of Pickerings lived in this house. And in that first 3 generations there were my ancestors, John Pickering, his son John Pickering, and John Pickering's son Benjamin Pickering. And I'll get to those in a moment. The house was sold by the family in the 1920s and is currently owned by the Pickering Foundation. A park now encompasses the area, and the Pickering house, open to the public, remains a prominent feature in the town within walking distance of the Salem Witch Museum and the House of the Seven Gables. The second book I discovered is titled Pickering Genealogy, and it delves deeper into the first 3 generations of the Pickering family in Salem, Massachusetts. The book begins with a disclaimer stating that no connections between any family of Pickerings in England and John Pickering of Salem has been established. But it also says, as no dedicated effort has been made to establish such a connection. So basically, they're saying that we know that John Pickering came from England. He came into Salem. He was this age, so he was born approximately this year, 1615, and so now it's in the 1630s, and that's all we know about him. The tradition is that he came from Yorkshire in England. Now, the book doesn't want to stop there because it then has a section on the Pickering coat of arms for both England and America. So they wanted people who were Pickerings, but not just Pickerings of this particular family of Pickerings. They wanted any and all Pickerings to buy this book because they would at least get this and then the other section out of the book. So there's a section on a coat of arms for Pickering. And I kind of am being satirical here. I mean, not satirical. That's not the word I was thinking. You have to cut for a moment. Back in position. I know I'm being sarcastic here, but because I think of coat of arms as being just a tad silly, in my opinion. I don't put much into coat of arms because they were something that was given to a particular branch of a particular family, and that coat of arms is owned by that particular branch. And so if you're not in that branch of that particular family, you don't really have a right, to claim this as being your coat of arms. So anyway, that's just me and coat of arms. As I said before, the book covers 10 generations of Pickerings, but I only focused on the first 3 generations in that book as being relevant to my research. So now, in the first generation, John Pickering is identified as the founder of the Pickering family in Salem, and he's reportedly born in England in 1615. And this is as per a record found in the family Bible of his grandson, John Pickering. Now, as I said before, family tradition suggests that he came from Yorkshire, but this is not definitively confirmed. But he did live in Ipswich, Massachusetts, between 1634 and 1637, before he moved to Salem. So the first documentation is of him having previously lived in Ipswich. And I don't know if that's documented in the Salem records or not. I don't think it's said. The very next line says, as documented in the Salem town records. So the Salem town records are the records that document him as having lived in Ipswich, Massachusetts between 1634 and 1637. Now, the records then go on to say that he was fined for fencing off land without authorization. However, it's unclear if that fine was ever collected. And that's a statement in the book. The book is saying it's unclear about that. it appears from what they further said in the book that the practice of fencing off unclaimed land was prevalent in those days, and that if John Pickering was engaging in that practice, he was not the only one doing it. So that's kind of, written at a later time. I think they're kind of poking the stick at the Puritan leadership of those days. John Pickering, lived from the 1630s until the late 1650s, so he predated the Salem witch trials by approximately 30 years. John was awarded a contract to maintain a bridge over the South River, but due to complications that arose, and it doesn't really go into detail about what those complications were, he was fined for, quote, defects in the bridge's construction. So I don't know if that meant that they think that he caused something, a defect in the bridge's construction, or if there were defects in the bridge's construction prior to his being awarded the contract to maintain it, and that he didn't fix them. I don't know. But there was a back and forth about that. And I guess his defense was that the defects were there before he took over the contract, and that they were saying that it didn't matter, or that he caused the defects or whatever. But anyway, he was threatened with having some of his belongings seized if he didn't comply, and I guess he didn't comply. And so the marshal was sent and seized a bull and a cow to pay off John's fine. So that's what's recorded in the town records. Now there is also recorded by one of his descendants, a man by the name of Timothy Pickering. This is a famous Pickering, Colonel Timothy Pickering, who was the first and I guess third Secretary of State of American history. So that's this Timothy Pickering. He apparently recorded that he believed that, and his grandfather or whatever believed that because of his perceived mistreatment by the elders of Salem, John Pickering said, forget about it, and he went down to Connecticut with the idea of establishing a plantation there. But that he got caught in bad weather while he was down there in Connecticut. And that's so funny, me saying the phrase down there in Connecticut, because I'm from the deep South. While he was down there in Connecticut, he suffered frostbite on both his legs, severe frostbite, and that this crippled him for the rest of his life, and probably is the reason why he died so young. He died in his 40s. So he went back to Salem, to the house that he had built in 1651, or actually started building. I guess it was one of these houses that was never quite finished until, maybe down until the 1920s. And so this incident in Connecticut with the frostbitten legs occurred around 1655, and that is when his will is dated. His will is dated July 30th, 1655, and that he died in 1657 at the age of approximately 40. And according to what is written in this book, that's what the authors of which are Pickering descendants, is that these injuries that he sustained during his journey to Connecticut was what caused his untimely death. And I think there was a little bit of animosity between the descendants of John Pickering and the elders of Salem town. And when you think about it, we're talking about a family that one branch or another of this family occupied the same house for almost 250 years, right? So I guess that's one of the reasons why that they emphasize, the cause of John Pickering's death. Upon his death, John divided his estate between his two sons. The elder son, my ancestor, stayed in the main house, while the younger son, and the son and the mother, Elizabeth, who later remarried, moved to another part of the property. Elizabeth's maiden name remains unknown, and there is no definitive date or location for their marriage. However, the Bible of their grandson, John Pickering, I guess he's John Pickering III, he suggested a marriage date of 1636, likely occurring in America. Well, I see by the old clock on the wall that we've run out of time for today, and that's all the time we have. So if you enjoyed watching this episode, don't forget to hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. Thank you and goodbye.